So welcome everyone to Queer Representations of AI. This is part of the Representations of AI series presented by the Digital Humanities Research Hub at the School of Advanced Study. Today's event is also part of the AI UK Fringe, which is organized by the Alan Turing Institute, which is where I sit. I'm going to be your host today. My name is Kalle Westerling, and I am a Research Application Manager at the Alan Turing Institute. This role means that I work with a lot of open source software packages. I'm helping software developers write interpretable and understandable code, documenting it and centering the end user in that work. So this work is centered a little bit more around AI and data science, but I also have a background in theater history where I've written extensively on drag and burlesque performance, both in a contemporary perspective and sort of throughout the long 20th century. So this afternoon, I will be moderating the conversation that we're going to have with our distinguished guests, who you can see on the screen in front of you, hopefully. We will go deep into the relationship between queerness and artificial intelligence. And I imagine that it will be a journey that transcends conventional narratives, challenges ideas about what's natural and commonsensical, and dares to reimagine what AI is or could be through the lens of queerness. Queering AI, as the event description of today says, questions the established ideas regarding sex and gender and binary thinking a little bit more generally. Queerness thrives in the defiance of what we consider normative. It's a quest to disrupt the status quo and to be a Spielverderber, or a killjoy, if you borrow a term from Sarah Ahmed. In the realm of AI, I think this translates to a critical examination of how prevailing representations shape and are perpetuated by AI technologies, data science, and machine learning. But it's not just about critique. I think it's also about repurposing AI, employing it as a tool for subversion and innovation. AI, as we know, has a certain potential to reinforce rigid categorizations of sex and gender, which is concerning because it mirrors often societal biases, obscuring the rich tapestry of human experience, winnowing it down to a tiny fraction of our lived intersectional experiences. Yet, it is in AI's errors and glitches that we can start to search for unexpected opportunities for resistance, to highlight the fluidity and complexity that queerness celebrates. And today, again, borrowing from the event description, we want to blast open the black box and foreground queer theory as a method for imagining novel possibilities and realizations of AI. And I wanted to just very briefly touch on three hopeful examples on my end, from a slide deck that I have of a few of the hopeful people that I think could give us a little bit of a starting point. So I'm going to try to share my screen very briefly. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to go to the next stage here. So first we have Jake Elves, who is a pioneer in the field of performance. In the performance piece, CZ and Me, they employ artificial intelligence to explore and affirm queer identities. And the performance, which you can see in these left images here, incorporates drag aesthetics into AI-generated imagery. Here, AI is reimagined as a tool for queer artistic expression, and Jake uses deepfake doppelgangers of performers to perform alongside their physical equivalents. To me, this is a vibrant and playful counter-narrative to the prevailing discourse on AI and marginalization, which, of course, is still very important to maintain. And I wanted to highlight this because if you want to see more of Jake's brilliance, join the AI UK opening provocation in person or on live stream on March 19th next week, where Jake and friends will do a performance-based piece. And we can post a link in the chat. I can see if I can do that very briefly, yeah, there you go. So I'm going to put that there, and that's a good kind of idea if you are curious about seeing more of this performance. Another example is this performance here. Chester Charles, who is a fictitious impressionist or a lost queer painter from the 1800s. The Lost Grandmaster, which you can see on the left there, is an exhibition which featured 23 AI-assisted works that imagine a queer twist on Impressionism. So here, the artist has used AI to challenge and reinterpret established art histories and to destabilize established narratives of a straight and heteronormative perspective on art history, with a capital A and a capital H, of course. And the final artist that I wanted to bring up here is Sarp Kerem Yavuz, who uses AI to bridge the gap between traditional photography and the digital frontier. He made an art form of curating data sets. In one recent exhibition, the data was based on his own photographs, AI-generated images from Midjourney, and famous photographs by a number of established photographers, among them Robert Mapplethorpe. And in the exhibition, Polaroids from the Ottoman Empire, he used AI, similarly to Chester Charles, to create an alternate reality in which the Ottoman Empire continues to exist into the 21st century, where portraits of imagined queer individuals are generated. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. Hopefully you were able to get to see those. So these are just a few examples of contemporary visual and performance artists who are on my radar, who are drawing on AI to make something different. And this afternoon, I'm excited. Well, it's afternoon for me. It may be different times where you are. This afternoon here, I'm excited to have with us 4 remarkable individuals, each a beacon in their field, ready to guide us through even more complex questions and intersections of AI and queerness, I'm sure. I will introduce them briefly before they talk, and I, or one of my co-conspirators, I'm looking here at Michael and Casper, Michael Dane and Casper Bielan, who is also on this call, who will post the entire bios in the chat, so you have a chance to read them through in your own time. I absolutely hate when people read my whole bio before I go on, because it's so boring, but it's always very informative, so it's good to have it available. So without further ado, I would love for us to jump into today's conversations, and we're going to start with Dr. Ed Chang. So first, I want to welcome you. Ed's research traverses technoculture, queer game studies, and digital humanities. And this afternoon, I think, but I'm not sure, we'll see, he'll reflect on algorithmic bias and other forms of technonormativity, especially in digital technologies that have become naturalized in our world. So the question here is, can AI be queer or be queered, past tense or active tense or something, in light of and in spite of normative and often toxic industry, code, practices, pedagogies, online cultures, commodification, militarization, and so on? And how could queer games provide a window into queering AI? So take it away, Ed.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Calais, is that how you pronounce your name? I forgot to ask you. Yes. Michael and Casper and all the organizers, and obviously the institution for hosting this. The questions I posed to you that you just read, I'm like, I don't even know if I could answer these. They're too big, but I will let you in. I think I'll start with just sort of my entrance. So my current work, which hopefully will materialize as a monograph this year, is on queer game studies, primarily thinking about the ways that video games sort of think about or deal with queerness, not just in terms of representation or narrative, which a lot of queer game studies is already sort of grappling with. But to really think about, like, you know, I think the first line I came up with for the book is, this book is looking for algorithmic queerness, and to sort of think about whether or not games themselves can be queer in a medium, at least currently, that is binary in nature, right? Quantum computing will probably F everything, but also might provide, you know, really different ways to sort of engage this question. But most games right now, if you ask, oh, can a game be queer? Most people point to, is there a queer character? Or is there a queer romance? Is the game doing something, you know, interesting or radical with gender, sexuality, identity, all that sort of stuff, which is great. I think that's really important, and I don't want to sort of take that away. But I'm also really interested in whether the game itself, right, what's going on under the hood, so to speak, what's churning in the code or in the back end, can that be queer? And that's where I think this overlaps with the idea of, you know, AI or any kind of sort of algorithmic engine, whether that itself is, if it's possible for it to be queer. So I just, right before this started, I went over to ChatGPT and asked, are you queer? And it basically said, you know, as basically a technology, It says, as an artificial intelligence language model created by OpenAI, do not possess personal characteristics such as gender identity or sexual orientation, blah, 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 which I think is really funny and really interesting because I don't know about you, but ChatGPT has a voice, right? Like when I read it, there is a voice, and it often sounds like brochure speak voice. But already, and I don't want to anthropomorphize the technology, but I do think something is going on there which is really interesting. And then I ask, can technology itself be queer? And it takes the kind of like, I don't know what to call it, like techno-libertarian route, which is like technology is a tool, it's a thing, how it is used might be queer, but it itself cannot be. And obviously, this is something I think we are trying to engage with here. So I guess my big things right now are trying to think about how we can think about the technologies that we use. And I really like the examples that you gave of like deploying them in ways that may be unexpected or interesting or strange or obviously queer. But I'm also want to think about the ways that technology itself might be sort of manipulated or reconfigured to do things that we may not expect. And I think as large language models get better and better, we might start seeing interesting things sort of come out of them. And then obviously one day, perhaps we will have strong AI or, AI that is quote unquote, intelligent or aware. And I think this is where Liz and I overlap. I'm interested in the sort of science fictional sort of representations of AI because it's often either it's going to save the world or it's going to destroy the world. And I'm interested in there's probably a middle ground somewhere. And maybe if we taught AI to be queer, it might actually make a better world for all of us, involved. So I'll stop there. I have more, but we can keep going.
Thank you so much, Ed, for those remarks. Just to be transparent with everyone, we're trying to get our fourth, or actually our third speaker online, so we might throw around in the program a little bit while we're solving for that. But we do have our second speaker here as well, and I'm excited to introduce Dr. Alicia Boyd, whose interdisciplinary approach bridges technology and humanity. Her commitment to integrating reflexive practices in tech development and policy formation challenges prevailing paradigms in AI and machine learning. She urges us to advocate for a more thoughtful, inclusive technological future. And we are so excited to have you here, Alicia. Bring it on.
Hi, thank you. That was so beautiful. I didn't do that. It's just like, oh my God, do I really do all that? Because sometimes I'm in my little space and I'm like, ah. So thank you for, spreading that joy and everything. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia. I thank you for joining and just having this conversation and what this looks like. A little bit about my work. It starts with intersectionality, but really bridging a gap to what is taking a reflexive posture within intersectionality. So reflexivity, for those who do not know or may be unaware of the topic or the subject, is it's a concept that requires the researcher to really look and turn on themselves to ask what biases, what assumptions, what are they pouring into their research. And if we were to take this concept and put it in AI technology, especially on the back end, like Edmund was talking about, what is that? How do those things, for a lack of better terms, bleed into our systems and really take on a shape and a form that is harmful to various communities? So taking reflexivity, it's very almost like a nebulous thing. And it's also a little bit of a painful thing because we have to force to be looking at ourselves and how we are contributing to a system when we're building it, when we're constructing it, when it goes into this black box. What is that? What are these things coming out of these systems that cause harm? Usually will ask these questions when stuff goes, things blow up, when they are sexist, racist, or some sort of hegemony that, presents itself. Reflexivity takes us to have a concerted pause at the beginning of this process, and then taking reflexivity along, asking, like, how do we mitigate these stuff before it gets to the general public? So it takes a little bit of a concerted pause. Now, one might ask, like, okay, this sounds awesome. How do we actually implement reflexivity? Well, that is the creative art part of it, where it's going to look different in each of these spaces. And in particular, a queer space, a recent article that was published called Should They? Titled Mobile Biometrics and Technopolicy Meets Queer Community Considerations. Here, that piece was a position paper, which really takes that concerted pause. My experience in a internship where we had to collect data and use accelerometers that are in our phones to ascribe gender. Now it's like, ooh, this is dangerous, because what about those that don't ascribe to any gender? What if it's, something that you're already imbuing your biases onto a phone placement based on ascribing gender? So this was very dangerous. So it made me think about the 1993 movie Jurassic Park, where Dr. Ian Malcolm, love Dr. Ian Malcolm, who asked that question, like, wait, should we be doing this, creating this technology, because what has anyone thought about the impacts and stuff? Well, that is a sense reflexivity, where you're taking that pause. Now, the movie did not go, they had to go down like a rabbit hole with this, with finding out, hey, this wasn't a good idea. But if we were to dial it back, reflexivity takes the parts of asking questions. What is it about me and my value systems that I want to show in this technology? Perhaps it's more about the process. Are these tools and technologies that we're using, that are incorporated into this AI design, is it harmful to various communities? What does that look like? Going back to the paper, we talk about how policy and particularly with biometric technologies can be harmful to queer communities, and out them and do different various things that are very harmful. So again, this is part of that one step of reflexivity, to really think about what we are doing in these different spaces. I'll stop right there because I feel like I'm rambling, and we can take some exploratory what if steps to have further discussions. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. That was fascinating. And I'm sure I can't hear applause, but I'm sure there's plenty of applause for both Ed and Alicia on the other side of the 67 screens that I have in the attendee list currently. I do want to remind people before we move on to the next speaker that we do have a Q&A function that we're using in the Zoom webinar. You should have it on the bottom of the screen, so right below me. And if your screen is too small, it might be under a More button. And then there's a Q&A. So if you press that, you should be able to get a little dialogue up where you can type your question out. You can also type it in the chat window if you want to the organizers, and then we will pick it up for you in the Q&A, because we're going to get to that eventually. We're just getting through all of the first kind of rambly or non-rambly. They're all welcome remarks. I appreciate them all. So we're gonna, I think, currently move ahead with our third speaker, and then we're gonna get back to our missing speaker. So let's move on to Liz Faber, our third speaker for today. So Dr. Liz Faber melds an array of disciplines from science fiction, which I think might tie in with the talk that we just heard, to queer studies, in their exploration of AI representations. I believe that Liz will explore how fictional AI is used in pre-existing tropes and narrative patterns. Very exciting. It is their contention that AI in science fiction often acts as stand-in for marginalized and exploited peoples, such as women, Black and Indigenous folks, and people of color. For example, I think we've all seen the countless texts that feature robots as slaves. How can we help explore the plurality of queer identities and stories? Could fictional AI be featured in more queer narratives? And can fictional AI be used in a more conscientious way across different media? I'm very curious about what Liz has to say about this. So thank you so much for being with us. Let's go.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. That's very nice. So yeah, I do focus primarily on narrative theory. In my first two books, the biggest thing that I wrote about was how in science fiction, we tend to take these sort of traditional gendered narratives and roles, and we just kind of plunk an AI in and say, okay, well, this one's a secretary, so it's a female, or this one's a psycho killer, so it's a male. And it plays out those gender dynamics, as well as in the ways that AI interacts with humans as well. So it builds those narratives of human-computer interactions into it. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is, through narrative theory, what does it mean to tell the story of being queer or of being trans? As a bisexual, non-binary person, I'm always interested in what does it look like and feel like and sound like, and what are the stories that show ourselves outside of the binary of male and female, which of course has been historically beautifully rendered through the metaphor of binary code as well. Lots and lots of writers, we see this a lot in literature, the use of binary code to sort of make interesting statements. I'm thinking specifically of Nikki Drayden's The Prey of Gods, which I was just teaching in my robots class a couple weeks ago, where she uses binary code for the robot, who eventually the binary spells out, I think, therefore I am. And so what does it mean to be is the foundational question of artificial intelligence. And with that, to sort of tie some of these strands together from Alicia and Ed as well, what does it mean to code as a queer person? What does it mean to tell your story as a queer person? And what does it mean as a queer community to represent ourselves and to see ourselves in not just in representations of AI, but in actual AI, which at its heart is representation. There is no tangibility to AI unless we situate it in a robot, which then becomes embodied, and that's a whole other question that goes on top of it, right? So what is the intangible quality of being queer that we would want to see in artificial intelligence? And I don't really have an answer to that. I can point to some texts that we've seen. I think my favorite is probably the 1984 film Electric Dreams, which features what looks like a traditional love triangle between a guy and his upstairs neighbor, a woman, and his computer that becomes sentient, and then falls in love with the guy's upstairs neighbor as well. So there's this sort of supposed heterosexual relationship between them, but in fact, the computer is also sort of in love with the guy, and his becoming sentient is also visually represented as sort of a sexual awakening. So it's really complex. It sort of breaks free of the traditional binaries that we see in heterosexual representation. And I think that's an interesting starting point, is what would queerness look like if AI were involved? And then I'll stop rambling about sci-fi now.
Thank you so much for those reflections. I think we have so many questions that are coming up that we don't get answers to. So it's like you're dangling really fascinating and interesting questions, all three of you, in front of us, and then everyone's just waiting for you to answer those questions. Hopefully, we'll get around to that. So we are still waiting for our fourth panelist to be able to connect. Unfortunately, she has had some issues with the Wi-Fi on her end. So I think in the interest of this, we are going to move into kind of a more discussion area of our talking, and then we'll see if she joins. You know, we can jump into quick remarks from her. We'll be flexible and on our feet, nimble in relation to this, and then we'll figure things out. So why don't we get started with some questions? And please, attendees, if you have picked up things that you want to ask our panel of distinguished speakers, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to touch on them. I'm sure you have plenty of questions, and you might even want to reiterate some of the questions from these kind of first remarks. But one of the things that I had put down as a question for myself, mostly from an extremely personal and just super curious, I just need more things on my bookshelf question. So I wanted to raise the fact that Donna Haraway's text, The Cyborg Manifesto, is celebrating 40 years old next year. And I know I'm as shocked as anyone about this. It's completely bananas, but obviously 40 years have gone by. We just heard a text from 1984, was it, or 85? So we're talking also about 40 years old at this point. So obviously things have happened in this period, right? Many people have written, many people have thought, many people have made things. So I'm curious to hear your kind of intellectual mappings, your routes through all of this thinking for how we can now imagine new possibilities for queer and trans identities in this kind of current moment that we're in, from your perspective, right? Who are your theoretical and practical heroes? Who are your prime kind of, like, who do you go to either get find joy or find hope, which I think is extremely important, specifically as queer people currently. Who are the people doing the good work out there? Who do you keep kind of coming back to? That's what I'm curious about. So because I'm so curious about this, I would really like us to go in the order of speakers, and then and hear kind of if you have names. I'm sure many attendees might be interested to go down to their local bookshop. I have one at the end of my little road that I go to and order my books. And so, and films and plays and, I don't know, visual art. What do you have for us? Ed, do you want to get us started? I see you looking at your bookshelf.
Yes, I'm just like desperately now looking around to sort of find stuff. I wrote my master's essay using Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto to try to write, I think I called it really pompously, Birth of a Cyberqueer Manifesto or something like that. It was horrible, but you know, we got to start somewhere as a graduate student. And I presented that work for the very first time at the Society for Literature, Science, and now Art, which is great, one of my favorite conferences. And she was there. She was the plenary speaker, and I was terrified she was going to come to my panel. She did not, but I did meet her later, and she was very lovely. So that's always been a touchstone text for me. And I think I just want to sort of say that, you know, everything that the Cyborg Manifesto has sort of partially, in a sense, predicted has come to pass. And one of the things that I always think about is that there is possibility for all of these technologies, but there's also like real risk. And so the first person I'll point to is Thomas Foster's work, Souls of Cyberfolk, which is pretty old now, but Tom Foster was my dissertation chair. And one of the things that I stuck with me from that book is that every technology used for liberation is the same technology used for domination. And that's something I think we have to think about, right? That all the kind of like techno-libertarian, techno-utopian ideas about AI, that it will free us all. Obviously, that's a possibility, but as many, many science fictional texts have told us, and many real world examples have told us, that's not likely to happen right now, because you know, we can't have nice things. So, and then, all the work being done by like queer game studies, ethnic game studies, which is, not really a thing, but I'm trying to make it a thing. I think is really great. So the work of folks like Tara Fickle, who wrote The Race Card, Bo Ruberg, who has written a gajillion things. My work, of course, and among other people. And then the thing I think that gives me the most hope, and I've been trying to weave into my sort of technoculture game study stuff, is obviously the work of Jose Esteban Munoz, specifically queer Cruising Utopia, which I think is really important, and Feeling Brown, which is his essays that were posthumously printed. So I think there's a lot there, that queerness is a horizon, right? That it's not quite here, but we can kind of feel it and want it. And I think queer AI or queer technologies is the same thing for me. So I have many more things, so maybe I'll make a list and put them in chat. Yeah, I pass it to Alicia.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. So I always want to pay homage to those who have come before tradition. So I would say like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, starting off with different like their books, because it just challenges like the dominant space. Like, what is it? Where are you positioned in relationship to a dominant space? How do you think about, how do you acquire their thoughts and make it to your own? So I always try to read texts that really challenge myself, and how do I get out and explore and do more things than being in my little bubble. So I start with those different types of those two authors. Patricia Hill Collins, especially her Black sexual politics, because it's challenging, again, what is sexuality, what is Blackness, all in this space, especially for a Black woman, which could be transferred to different spaces as well if you morph those questions into different spaces. Some other books that I just come across and like, ooh, let me read more, is How the Internet, it's called The Digital Closet, How the Internet Became Straight. That's a really good one. Just to think like, oh my goodness, this was here before. Look how, patriarchy and straightness and just imbue into different systems. Also, Gender Circuits by Eve Shapiro is another one, just as, again, how does this feed into systems? Another, I've been finding different authors. It's titled Them Goons Rules, Fugitive Essays on Radical Black Feminism, written by Marquise Bay, they, them pronouns. So really, challenging the structures and systems of power, and challenging what this binaryism like outside of that. And again, these are where some reflexive questions can come up, just to sit there and explore, but also just sit with the uncomfortability of it and ask yourself what is resonating with you. Again, going back to that concerted pause that we can do with ourselves, saying like, what's coming up? What are some things that perhaps I need to deeply explore, journal about. When I read these texts, among others, that's where I start with. like, how can I grow further as a person, as a, individual, and not be afraid to look at myself in the mirror and to walk with a boldness and a firmness in the complexity that I bring into different spaces. So, and I will give it over to Liz.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Alicia was saying too, that we can't do this without an intersectional understanding. So a lot of what I go to comes back to disability rights, to race, critical race theory. My immediate thought as Ed was talking was Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? So how do we balance that with technology as well? A couple of things. I am on spring break, so I don't have my bookshelf. I'm not in my office, but just kind of off the top of my head. There's a brand new book by Danya Glubau and Laura Forlano from MIT Press that's just called Cyborg. And they do an entire chapter sort of taking Cyborg Manifesto to task, and thinking about how it contributed really wonderful things, but is often really reductive. Particularly in terms of sexuality, but also disability. That's a big focus of their book. And I think cyborg studies is really interesting in the way that it intersects with disability studies. The work of Rebecca Gibson is really fabulous. She writes about sexuality and artificial intelligence. Her first book is called AI and the Desire in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. But a lot of her work is about sort of the sexuality of robots in science fiction. She's a fabulous bioanthropologist. And then my more recent work is sort of focusing on AI and race. So I think a lot of the current critical theorists who talk about race and AI are really informative for really talking about any form of oppression and how we can sort of understand each other and sort of work together to really address oppression. So in particular, Isaiah Lavender III, he has a really excellent book on race and robots in science fiction. There's another one called Surrogate Humanity by Kalinda Vora and Nita Antonasowski. So that's on the critical theory side. I'm going to put in some science fiction stuff as well. I think coming from literature, there's lots of really interesting stuff. There's an anthology that's now a couple of years old called Meanwhile Elsewhere, Science Fiction and Fantasy from Transgender Writers. Is not entirely about AI, but there are some stories in there that sort of get to cyborgness and disability and transness and sort of how those things function together. It's a really beautiful collection of stories. I had another one that has completely left my brain, so if I think about it, I will put it in the chat. Yeah, I think that's about my list. There is unfortunately not a ton of robot fiction. Oh, I remember what the other one was. Dirty Computer. Oh my goodness. And the name of the artist I've also forgotten.
Janelle Monáe.
Thank you, Janelle Monáe. You guys are witnessing me run out of language right now. So Janelle Monáe's work, obviously they're a non-binary singer. They're also, they're Black, and their work at the kind of intersection of science fiction and music and queerness is just completely beautiful and highly recommend.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing Janelle Monáe into the conversation as well. I love the idea that music is now also, because I feel like I did a little bit of visual stuff. We've talked a little bit about literature, and now we also have music. So we're bringing all of the different arts into the conversation. I'm also happy to hear you brag about your own work. So please, if you have anything that you want people to read, you should put that in the chat as well. And feel free to drop. Ed has already done that, a few reading tips for our audience into the chat. I think that's really great. So I have another question that I would love to hear your thoughts about, and I've heard it throughout your talks, and so I really like I want to. I think in some of your cases, it's more about reflecting the question back at you that you've raised, and so the question really that we're kind of I don't know, we're jumping around a little bit, is this idea, can AI even be queer or queered, given this kind of binary nature that some of you have touched upon in these digital technologies, in the way that it works, in these kind of binary structures that we have, in the fact that most of these questions come in way too late in the construction of these systems. All of these things that you've been talking about, right? But is it possible? And what would it mean to be a queer AI, right? Like how can we think about kind of fantasizing what that would kind of look like? What is a queer artificial intelligence? Obviously, we have ChatGPT as a great example. Thank you, Ed, for running that query through ChatGPT, where we get a very like black and white answer, right? Of like, that's it. I don't have any of these characteristics yet. I just saw a meme yesterday actually. That was this sort of it started with me saying thank you to ChatGPT, and then the end of the world on the other side of the strip, right? Like, what is the path, to destruction here? Is it this kind of humanization of these technologies, or is that rather the way that we're supposed to be going? So what would it mean to sort of be a queer AI, or what would it mean to kind of build it? What's our fantasizing around that as a collective panel, I guess. I don't know if we want to go the same way around, if everyone wants to touch on it, or we can be flexible about it.
Well, the earliest queer AI I can think of is Hal from 2001. Now, in the long line of murderous gays, queers, but he's so sassy. But we just want a good A, use that sass for good instead of, well, I guess he was kind of using it for good. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
He was a good jealous husband, is what he was doing, and by good I mean not the part where he murders everybody. Just that was his representation. I mean, I guess I'll jump in. I honestly, I don't know. This is something that I deal with personally too, is what does it mean to be non-binary? What does being non-binary look like? And the answer is that's not a thing. So that sort of is the complexity of it. But I think also sort of what does it mean to perform ourselves, and in what ways have we historically been asked to perform hegemony, and what does it mean to break free of that? I'm sorry, I'm asking more questions instead of answering them, but honestly, I don't really have an answer. Like, the way that cishet culture sees queerness is so bound up in sex and sexuality and binary gender identity, that sort of breaking free from that, any act of breaking free from that, is a radical queer act. And so then really the heart of the question is, what would that look like to code it in? Is it just getting more data so that you have a broader output, right? Or is it, I don't even know what an alternative to that would be.
Go ahead, Alicia, if you had a thought.
Oh, just going from that, there's a lot that's wrapped up in like opposite of difference. Like, what does that look like? And I don't think that we as a society state there's not like, not saying it has to be a word for it, but there's not enough encouragement to say, just stay there. Like, let's think about this. What does this look like? Because again, like you said, it reminds me of like Audre Lorde, you know, we cannot dismantle this house that's already built for something else that wasn't meant for us in this space. So what does it look like when we don't use those tools and come over to a space and create that itself? And I think that's where we can start asking ourselves, like, hey, you know, what does it look like to do this differently and not insert this? And I'm using very vague language because, you know, you don't know really what it looks like. It's like exploratory time to try to tinker and see what that looks like. It makes me think about early characters on in like science fiction, you know, that like for instance, like Dax from DS9, who, you know, I'm pretty sure there were some other characters before in the Star Trek lore that have been queer non-binary. I think of Data, like Data could easily been non-binary, but it's so rigid with their structure, like patriarchy, have to do this. What happens if there's elements? What if there's like a safe space for feelings? Because Data was against feelings. He had to switch off a chip to be like, oh, gotta turn this off. Can't have a feel, you know. What happens if we just stay in that space that makes us uncomfortable and really not have our own prejudices with it, but just let it be?
I'm going to offer some provocations because I think one of the things that, you know, we're all grappling with in this current technological moment is our relationship to all of these different technologies that are emerging, right? I might want to think about, like, since we were talking about like stereotypical or problematic or hegemonic representations of queerness, usually as bad, murderous, corrupting, you know, we can go down the list, right? Then if we use that as a sort of mode, and I'm not saying this is true, I just want to use this as a thought experiment, then AI as we know it, it already is queer because it is already threatening. It is already threatening the status quo in so many ways. There's so much pearl clutching. And how might we leverage that as a way to sort of think about and use that as an opportunity to intervene in our relationship? And that's not to say that technology, I mean, there's so much algorithmic bias and all of that sort of stuff at work. But I'm really fascinated because we don't know what AI looks like without, let's say, ChatGPT, for example. We don't know what ChatGPT looks like without all of the guardrails that have been put up. I was really surprised that it answered the question, are you queer? Because that seems like one of those words that are like, I can't talk about that because, you know, it's bad. And I imagine AI doing this, like a Muppet. So that's one thing I'm thinking about is that, like, there are things that are already happening in the discourses around AI that already feel like we're talking about something queer. It itself may not be, but it might be an interesting way to sort of like pry open some of these sort of problems. And then the other thing, since we've been talking about aliens and science fiction and stuff, I wonder, because it's all provisional, we don't have the language, right? We just don't know yet. We don't know how to talk about these things. And I think even us as well-meaning, whatever, woke, liberal, queer, non-binary folks, wanting AI to be queer is already mapping meaning onto something that might actually install its own kind of normativities and biases, right? Maybe AI is just AI and it's not a human thing, but it might be doing other things. So that's something that I'm also thinking about.
Yeah, I was sort of coming to the same thought, Ed, as well, that being queer it comes from within, right? You're not queer because someone says you're queer. You're queer because you say you are. And so what would it mean for an AI to say that, right? I don't find it surprising that ChatGPT does it, because Siri answers that question as well. When I was writing my dissertation on AI and gender, Siri had just come out. And so, which itself is a fun phrase, Siri had just come out. Siri had just been released for iPhone 4S. And I was playing around a lot with sort of asking her different questions and seeing how she answers. And those answers did change over time as they changed her programming as well. And so those are sort of interesting things that are in the minds of programmers, and interesting ways that the AI could be used. And I'm constantly reminded of sort of how we think of the construction of identity. So is it always in relationship to an other? I am I because you are you, and I understand I because I understand you. Or is it something a little bit more cyclical and complicated? For me, I sort of followed Judith Butler's writing about identity and understanding, even beyond gender, just in thinking of the way that we narrate ourselves and the way we tell our own stories. And so can AI do that? Or is AI only telling other people's stories? And this is where I break my students' brains. Is the way that we tell our stories just based on data we've gotten from culture, right? How is that different from the way that we program an AI? Are we just input output? And how does that change the nature of sort of understanding ourselves, not just as queer people, but as people? And I think the thing that's frightening about that is one of the things that is frightening in science fiction often is, if we are just machines, is just machine a real thing, right? Or is understanding ourselves, are we understanding ourselves through working these points out about artificial intelligence? Are we going to come to a better understanding of ourselves by figuring out how queerness is articulated and told through something that's artificial? Again, I'm asking
add that
and answering.
even as we're wrangling, going back to the Audre Lorde problem, right? That we can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And that's really important to sort of think about. And at the same time, you know, even if identities are socially constructed or whatever, there are still real world, real lived experiences, consequences to those things. And so we also have to engage the master's tools at the same time we are trying to create other tools, or maybe tools in-house are not the right metaphor, but it might be, you know, something else. And I don't know what that is.
And also gets us back to mind-body dualism, right? You kind of can't escape Descartes in this as much as we want to, because part of queerness is embodiment. And can queerness exist without embodiment is a big question. I don't know that it can. But then also a lot of my work questions whether embodiment is really just having a human body, right? If we're really going to talk about cyborg identity, what does it mean to be augmented with technology? Is that still a body? And I would say yes. So I think that sort of also has to be taken into account, is what is the embodiment of queerness, and how does AI embody queerness?
But you're right in bringing up Descartes. I think it's really an interesting way of doing it, right? I mean, because that's kind of going back to the Cyborg Manifesto to some extent, and also that placement in kind of animal studies and coming from that perspective, right? Like this idea of like, okay, so what if we transplant the pig heart, right? Like what happens with, like, we use it as such a metaphor for what is a human. Well, I love you with my whole heart, but what if it's a pig heart? Like those are questions that aren't, they sound so far-fetched, but they're so connected to what we're talking about after all, right? I wanted to throw into the mix here that in advance of today, I obviously did some research on like what is queer AI, right? And some of these artists are the people that sort of came across my radar and I already knew about. But there were some others that also came up, and there have been sort of clinical studies done on LLMs that have been retrained for purposes. I know one of the important ones that I found was Crisis Contact Simulator that was developed by the Trevor Project that emulates potential conversations callers to the helpline, right? They have a support helpline for people who are experiencing loneliness and despair in their queer identities. And so it emulates conversations. I think it was first called Riley and then Drew. So they were fictional young people in their early 1920s residing in California. So like very sort of US centric. Riley and Drew to me sort of really rings of like you have this vision of some, you know, young white gay in California, right? Like it's a very kind of stereotypical thing, but it's been used for training counselors, and there haven't been any clinical effectiveness studies of that yet, but there are plenty of other examples of that. And it's just evocative of what you're saying, right? Like that there's this like I think Ed, you said you brought up the guardrails of ChatGPT, and it sort of makes me think of the importance maybe of having an open source ecosystem of models here, right? Like this idea of like we can't have one model fix all. But then on the other hand, I've also heard of plenty of people who have tried to run these sort of local models of whatever, like, you know, open source alternatives we have for ChatGPT, and they are spewing out things that you definitely don't want to see or be in touch with. And then on the other hand, you have these, you know, LLMs that are specifically trained to do this type of training counselors, or it's even been, you know, used in Brazil. I know there's a chatbot that was called Amanda Selfie that was trained on gender neutral language that was trying to increase PrEP uptake and reduce exposure to HIV, and had a study done, a 3-stage study done that concluded that it did increase it, but only very little. So there are these things, right? Like, but is it queer, or is it, you know, like this is sort of where the question for me lands, right? Like, because like you're saying, Liz, the only exposure I have really to all of these things, I used to be an avid sci-fi reader when I was much younger. Nowadays, after doing a PhD, I have an aversion to picking up a book in my hand at times. But then I took a science fiction class in my PhD with an excellent professor, one of my favorites, and she kept going on about how sci-fi just is a regurgitation of all of our anxieties about humanity, right? Like it's always like this sort of, oh my God, we're dying of X, and now we have to make up all these narratives that cover up or help us get through that anxiety. So she was talking about the sort of emergence of all of these like virus movies in the 1980s, right? Like the virus is coming to kill humanity, and of course it was the rising fear of HIV and AIDS that sort of was dealt with in this sense. But yeah, so that this was just like my my way of raising the question here of sort of the queerness of the potential queerness of large language models, and maybe large language is contradictory to some extent to what queerness is or even can be in the end. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone wants to say anything or if we want to move on to other questions.
I'm going to quickly put in a plug for Karl Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots from 1920, which is about a robot uprising. Spoiler alert, the robots kill all the humans. But to sort of echo what you were saying, Kale, is like that's about labor rights. It's very much entrenched in the Soviet Revolution and everything that was happening in the teens and then into the early 20s, and that is what science fiction shows us. And so that's part of why I'm so interested in the way that we tell our own stories. But again, this is something that queer theorists have been grappling with forever, is what are our stories? What does that even mean? And as Ed was saying, the second we define it, is it no longer queer? Right? Because we're situating it into sort of a set of information that's necessarily binary.
Those are great points. Thank you. Casper has unvideoed himself.
Hi.
So I think it's time for us. We have about 27 minutes left of today's conversation. And we want to make sure that we give some time and space for all of our attendees to ask questions as well. And so I really want to open this up to the audience at this point if you have questions. And I do see that we have one question, which is something that we've maybe talked about briefly already. But maybe we'll do a quick round of who are your favorite queer characters in fiction?
I hate these questions because it's so hard to pick.
And the second someone asks the question, it's like I've never read a book in my life. It just everything leaks out.
I don't know about favorite, so I'm just going back to like, what have I just taught? I always do that because I think that's really important. I love anything by Octavia Butler and or James Baldwin. And those characters, I mean, Butler doesn't overtly necessarily write about queerness, even though she does. But Baldwin's characters obviously are, I mean, these are really, really messy people. And I think that one of the great things about those characters, so let's say in another country, our queerness is he allows the mess to be messy. And I think that's something that I'm starting to miss the nuance of what it means to be a queer character, especially in games and mass media and such, because we want identity to be clear and legible because we've been fighting for visibility for so long. But then you're like, but wait, like, you know, as a person who identifies as a gay man, as a queer man, like my identity is messy, and it's you know, and I think that's something that queer AI or queer code or queer technology will need to also grapple with, which is right now computers are really bad at messy, right? So yeah.
I think I would say Dax. I'm a huge Star Trek Trekkie. I am a Trekkie, undercover Trekkie. I like really good stories that really have good character development and really just like Edmund said, like going through the messiness and being okay with the messiness and sorting that stuff out. And also getting it wrong as well. What does that process and that journey look like? I think of the Roswell show that got rebooted. They had really good like a writing team, and the characters that reportrayed the what's his name, Michael. I like how they put him as a queer character and then tussing with that with his growth and journey through the Roswell. I will not do spoilers. I will just I'll just keep it. It was just it was a good journey, but it did kind of get bonky because of the writer's strike and everything. But I just reflect on different authors and different characters who really do a good job of like Edmund said, showing that messiness, being okay with it, and just what does that journey look like as you're just going through life, trying to figure stuff out as situations happen. So.
Ironically, my favorite queer characters are not in science fiction. My favorite novel ever is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, where the main character isn't explicitly queer, but I have always read her as queer. And
She's queer.
She's a disaster queer, and I love her. And my favorite television show right now is Our Flag Means Death, which is just a gay pirate rom-com with Rhys Darby and Taika Waititi. So I highly recommend it. In science fiction, I think every character on Farscape is queer in some way, including the spaceship. A few years ago, I wrote a paper called Sex in the Single Spaceship. It was about spaceship sexuality. And in Farscape, their spaceship is a bioship, so it's living, and it has a baby at one point. And so there's a sort of queerness to her and her child in the way that they kind of interact with the humans and with each other. So highly recommend that show as well.
Very nice. Thank you so much for sharing. Oh, we have a very long question in the chat.
Should I try to rephrase it, but maybe we can quickly go to a long-standing question in the chat about if you could quickly recapitulate on Jake's works with on queer artistic expression using deepfake doppelgangers.
Right, I did see that question. So just to reiterate, so Natasha asks, could I please say something else about how AI is reimagined as a tool for queer artistic expression using deepfake doppelgangers in Jake L's work? Yeah, I'm going to put a link actually to a YouTube video that you don't want to click right now because it starts boom very loud, as drag should, but it will show you what Jake has done, which I think is really interesting. Speaking of like training models and all of that, this taps more into kind of generative AI, not as LLM, but as video performance, whatever you want to call it. So during the pandemic, I think Jake used neural networks to try to build these models of faces built on drag performers of any gender and sex and sexualities and you know, it was people of color. Like, it was a very wide ranging data set. And so you can see in that video what the result of this is. And I guess I could share my screen as well.
Kelly, can you is this of real people or is this of
so
fiction?
Well, yes. Speaking of the complexities, right, I'm sorry, I can't share my screen because it just won't do the YouTube, so you can go to that link yourself. So it's trained on real performers from, I think, predominantly London, at a cabaret venue during the COVID pandemic. So they've recorded videos and then trained a generative AI to create deep fakes essentially based on these performers. And so you will see the method explained in that video a little bit more, but it's essentially like mapping merging existing performers into one data set that is then mapped onto kind of spines of moving pieces that regenerate this thing. And, you know, I think it's kind of a provocative piece because it generates questions about, you know, all the things that we've been talking about, including the, you know, it's an artist who takes with the permission of the performers, right? Which is important to point out because
That's
there has
the big
been
thing.
countless,
Yeah.
yes,
Consent.
exactly. There's been countless examples of obviously generative AI that takes people's work and regurgitates that into these types of things. And so it's really like a creative way of saying, okay, so what can we do with AI? How can we do something that disrupts this type of conversation that we have currently, and actually build an artistic practice from it, right? That ties in with this practice. And so by tying in, I also want to point out that then, and you'll see this if you join us for AI UK next week. So I'm putting in a plug for that again. It's going to be early for people in the Americas, considering that it's going to be in the morning over here in London. But what Jake does is that they bring live performers, specifically Me the Drag Queen, a confusing drag name, but it's Me the Drag Queen, brings them up on stage and performs with their sort of deep fake alter ego, and they do a number of songs that are obviously playing on the idea of this duality of kind of the same person, but obviously if you look at the video you will see that it looks semi not human at all, so sort of like breaks with that kind of trope as well, which I think is interesting in and of itself, right? It ties in with this queerness as something that goes beyond just thinking about it as a chatbot that simulates a white gay man living in California, and does something a little bit more exciting with that. So I hope that explains a little bit more about that, and that can help answer that question.
Perfect. Shall I try to rephrase the question in the Q&A? Because I think it's very much something that was also very much in my mind. Like, we have been talking about queer representation and queering AI, but what about people working in AI, queer people working in AI? I think the question suggests like the discussion has been often quite theoretical. So what are the more practical suggestions for people working in the field? So the question says, we are here, but it's hard to bring down quite a lot of the theoretical criticism into the actual practice of development of AI. So what type of queer coding do we need more of?
So one thing I would say, something that Sophia Noble brings up in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, is hire queer theorists. Like, put them on your research team, have somebody in the room to say, hey, this is a bad idea, or hey, here's some more information that you need. I do a lot of peer review for AI journals that are mostly articles written by software engineers or other types of sort of hard science researchers. And my role in those peer reviews are often to be like, hi, there's 30 years of feminism that you should be thinking about here. So I think genuinely get another voice in the room is my biggest advice.
I get this question a lot for when I do queer game stuff, because then people are always like, well, are there queer games? And I'm like, yes, of course there are. That's why it's a provocation, but it's a way to think about like, what are the affordances and limitations of the very technology that you're using? And I have a similar answer, right? Like, you have to get people in the door, in the room, that can sort of, code from a different perspective. If we believe that biases are being encoded in the things that we are creating, and they are, then having different bodies and identities and teams and collaborations will at least start changing some of those things, right? We're starting to see that happening in Hollywood, for example. I mean, it's very, very small, but a lot of the things that are being produced now are really different than when I was a younger, queer person. And then the other thing is really to just, I think maybe Alicia can talk more about the reflexivity thing, but it's about, again, checking yourself all of the time. I'm also free for a consultation. Like, it's really surprising that companies want this, but don't want to pay for it. And so, like, I think, there are a lot of experts out there that could help you, but you have to really invest. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And asking once when you're in these rooms, ask these questions like we have been asking, like, what is the purpose of this? Who is this going to harm? Let's think about this from a different perspective. Like, broach these questions, because we need these questions and these voices that are out there behind the scenes. So maybe perhaps that we won't get a disastrous impact on the end. Encourage being proactive in this, in your position, as far as, hey, let's think about this. How is this going to hurt, trans people? How is this going to hurt, particularly trans people of color? How is this going to impact and send further messaging of, dominant structures that we need to dismantle? Your mission statement is to be inclusive. Well, right now we're not doing inclusivity. So what does it look like to put this into praxis? So start to, ask these questions, and it's going to unravel to other questions that to ask, like, hey, should we be using these tools because perhaps this is, disenfranchising particular groups. So therefore, maybe we don't need to go down this path. Is there another way to explore? And ask, when you're in these rooms, is there a way that we can build in time to like really sit and discuss, like, what are these ramifications? What are these impacts? And really getting outside of what's in the room and explore what's going outside in the world and in our communities.
I do want to add to that. I just had there was a talk at my institution by a researcher on cybersecurity, and one of the things that he said was that most of the problems of cybersecurity are not technology based. They're actually about social engineering, right? So like the reason you have leaks is because somebody keeps clicking on that email that they shouldn't be clicking on, right? And so on and so forth. And I take that again, I go back to this, I keep using this phrase, relationship to technology, right? And that a lot of our coding, or the other way to say it is, solving problems of technology sometimes isn't using technology, right? Like that's not the thing that we need to do. We can build better code, obviously, but at the same time, you have to bring in all of the other stuff that is happening. And so thinking about that kind of social or cultural engineering is definitely a part of the picture.
This is great. I just added a bunch of things in the chat as well, where both resources that I came across when I was sort of preparing for today, most of which probably is important to the person who asked the question. I know you were anonymous, so I don't know who you are, but there's the Queer in AI organization, and then there are a number of other sort of in AI organizations that I posted there. I don't know to what extent there's conversations happening across those, and that would be a really interesting thing for me to know more about, if anyone has insight into that. I know that they're also vastly different organizations. I also put Out in Tech on there, which is extremely different organizations to all the other ones. Now, the organizers of Queer in AI have published a really interesting paper called Queer in AI, a case study of community-led participatory AI, that has some ideas for kind of how to bring these learning points to kind of decision makers within organizations and corporations. And I think it's really interesting. It comes out of the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. So that's a really interesting paper. I also put 2 other papers there that came across my radar. The last one was published in 2021, and it really discusses the different technological impacts on queer communities that AI technologies have, and was really helpful, just kind of grasping some of these issues, and I think would help frame it maybe within the context of software development and computer scientists, which we do have to code switch. And those of you who have consulted on these things, it's you kind of have to stand. I mean, I'm coming from a humanities background myself, and now I work at the National Institute for Data Science and AI in the UK, and you do have to kind of have both of these sides active at the same time. And I see Sharon Webb shared also some really great resources, and feel free to keep them coming. I think it's really great to have kind of a resource chat where we can kind of share these resources. And I know Casper had put things into a spreadsheet as well, which we can share after with the participants, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to have a transcript, because I won't remember all of these things.
Yeah, I'm trying to put everything in a Google Doc, and we'll share it later with people. So don't worry. I'm trying to copy paste everything in time.
I just want to say that I need to find the link to it, but I think looking to other communities that are doing similar work, so like your Indigenous in AI reminded me, or even so Black communities, Indigenous communities, disability communities are also working on tools in thinking about that sort of relationship between that set of identities and the other. And so there might be ways to sort of do some recombination, right? I hate to say borrow, you should always credit people, but like I think to think about, well, what does an indigenous like coding language look like might help us get a clue for what perhaps a queer coding language might look like, and so on and so forth. And I think that's why that's exciting, right? There's a lot of sort of resonances happening.
I put this in the chat as well. There's a lot of stuff in science communication research right now that is about doing science with communities rather than seeing science as sort of apolitical or even like as just building a product that humans might use generally. So I added Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, which is a really wonderful book that is more about climate science, but I think it's applicable across industries and across fields of scientific research, to think kind of like what Alicia was saying, who is the stakeholder in whatever you're doing, and how do you work with them? How do you listen to them? How do you build their needs into whatever it is that you're designing?
Yeah, with reflexivity, looking at different disciplines, for instance, like nursing, asking the questions like how is this helping you versus, how is it helping the researcher? Looking at different like medical texts. My background is in medicine, so usually I'll pull from there to try to develop like reflexive questions that are, and adapt them to the environment or the context in which I'm situated in. So lately I've been working with disability studies and data annotation. So what does it look like to build reflexive questions coming from an able-bodied, presenting able-bodied person coming into the space, asking somebody, what is your life like? We have to be having reflexivity, not only with myself, asking, is it appropriate to take on that position? And also, do we need people who are part of the community to lead that research and let them ask what are their aims, what are their goals, so it won't be about the company or the key stakeholder, because this has impact on the communities, looking at this technology, like how is this going to benefit us? So what does it look like to change those dynamics, those structures, to allow communities drive that project and give them the resources to make it successful and sustainable?
That's great. I think technically we have time for one more question, if there are any more questions from the audience. Let's see. Do get some more suggestions for resources, which is also really great. Thank you so much, Laura, for bringing up the care principles for data. There are other attempts as well, I should mention, for like creating these types of transparency and inclusion in different data settings. I'm working myself on a project that is also trying to do some of this, using some of these principles, but it's slow work and it's not queer. And I think you unmuted. Did you want to say
I was going to say, if there wasn't a question that you should ask the question about joy and queer futures in AI, and maybe end on a happy note. Or
I feel like we've had
talked a little about
we've had a nice like undercurrent of like trying to keep our head over the surface, which I think is a good motto for all of us who are living through today times. But yes, again, I am curious about like where you find more of that kind of radical joy, if you will, in the field of AI for this type of queer futurity that we've been talking about, right? And I think it ties in with the question that we asked before, right? What type of queer coding do we need more of? What, like where do you find this type of thing? I saw that you shared some games, Ed, and so maybe that's where you find joy.
Well, I was thinking about this. I was like, what if we are the masters of our, or you know, the creators of our own destruction by all of the anxiety and fear that we have over this technology is also being embedded in the technology as we're creating it, using it, thinking about it. And not to say that we shouldn't be cautious. I think that's really important and ethical and like all those sorts of things. But I do think looking at the things that people are doing that is wonderful and lovely and magical and messy and all this stuff, I think is also really great because, you know, I think that's you know, really important. So I'm going to do a plug. So I teach a queer digital humanities course with Dr. Jason Boyd at the Digital Humanities Summer Institute in lovely Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And we talk about some of these issues. It's not on the website right now, but we generated a course description for us that was written by ChatGPT that is hilarious as hell. And so I want to get it switched over because we asked it to write a course description for us, but in like a queer voice, and it decided that it was a drag queen. And so it's really funny. Anyway, so that's my queer joy. I'll put a link in.
Yeah, my joy. I get joy to being in these spaces right here, just having these conversations from all everywhere, because it makes me like reflect and think like, huh, how can I do better? Like not only in my professional life, but how can I do better and more affirmed in my personal life? So this gives me time to really just be patient, and be excited for the micro movements that we're having, because you never know what that's going to spill over to bigger things. So I'm hopeful for the young scholars that are coming out of here, thinking, you know what, let me just try, because that's like all we need, somebody like to really just try and just walk in boldness of and affirm who they are, saying, oh, it's okay, because I'm going to ask a reflective question like in this space, because it only takes once. And so I'm really joyful and happy for what the future can bring. There's some exciting stuff, and I'm just really excited for all of that. And thank you.
I find joy in being queer in an age where technology exists. Like, this is real old school, but just on a personal level, I grew up in an extremely small Midwestern town where there were no out gay people. I didn't know anybody who looked like me, or was like me. And so I was in AOL chat rooms, and that's how I met gay people at first and like figured out who I was. And I think that is something that continuously brings me joy, is that things like what is queer AI acknowledges that we exist and we are important and we thrive. And to me, that is the definition of queer joy.
Thank you. That is wonderful. We are over time by 1 minute, so I do want to thank on that beautiful final note. And I also saw that Ed added the fabulous concept, sassy methodologies, and techno-magical glitter. And I really think that I hope that we've spread some techno-magical glitter over the attendees in this session. And I really, really want to thank the three of you for being here, Liz, Alicia, and Ed. And also to Casper and Michael for organizing this wonderful event, and to the Turing Institute and to SAS for putting this on the radar. It's good for us to be able to have these conversations. And so thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all the attendees for staying with us through this hour and a half, and hopefully we'll get to see each other again somewhere in the cyberspace.